The airport buzzed with activity as travelers rushed to their gates. Among them walked a tall woman with perfectly styled hair and designer luggage, moving with the confidence of someone who expected the world to make way. She checked her watch, a gleaming piece that cost more than some people's monthly rent, and headed toward the priority boarding line for Flight 372. First-class passengers may now begin boarding, announced the gate agent. The woman stepped forward immediately, handing over her boarding pass with a practiced smile. New York for the weekend, she said, though nobody had asked. Business conference, very important clients. The gate agent nodded politely and returned her boarding pass. Enjoy your flight, Miss Carter. Ms. Carter strolled down the jet bridge, already mentally rehearsing her presentation for Monday morning. She'd worked at her marketing firm for 11 years and had recently been passed over for promotion. This conference was her chance to prove herself worthy of reconsideration. As she entered the plane, a flight attendant greeted her warmly. "Welcome aboard. Your seat is 2B on the right side." The first-class cabin gleamed with its wide leather seats and ample legroom. Miss Carter moved toward her assigned row, her good mood instantly souring when she spotted who would be her seatmate for the 5-hour journey. A young black boy of about 10 sat in the window seat, completely absorbed in a thick book about airplanes. He wore neat, though not obviously expensive clothes, a blue button-up shirt and khaki pants. His small carry-on bag was tucked perfectly under the seat in front. Ms. Carter's steps slowed. She glanced around the cabin, counting the filled seats and frowning at the realization that the flight appeared completely full. For a moment, she stood in the aisle, creating a small traffic jam as other passengers tried to move past her. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" asked a flight attendant named Rita, who had noticed her hesitation. Ms. Carter paused, lowering her voice slightly but not enough to prevent being overheard. "I was wondering if there might be another seat available, perhaps next to someone more suitable." The boy didn't look up, but his small hand tightened noticeably on his book. His shoulders tensed, though he continued to stare at the pages. Rita's professional smile didn't waver, but her eyes cooled slightly. "I'm afraid we're fully booked today. Is there a specific concern with your assigned seat?" "It's just that I have important work to review," Ms. Carter said, gesturing vaguely at her expensive leather portfolio. "I need to concentrate, you understand." "All of our first-class seats offer the same amenities and comfort," Rita explained patiently. "And our young passenger has been perfectly well-behaved." A businessman across the aisle glanced up from his newspaper, his eyes moving between Miss Carter and the boy, his expression unreadable. "Fine," Miss Carter said with poorly concealed annoyance. She placed her designer bag in the overhead compartment and slid into her seat, making a point of sighing loudly. The boy shifted slightly closer to the window, still not looking up from his book. A page about commercial airplane engines was open, covered with detailed diagrams that he seemed to understand perfectly. "Excuse me," Ms. Carter called, raising her hand to summon another flight attendant before they'd even left the gate. "Could I get a glass of champagne? It's been a stressful day." As she settled in, making a show of arranging her things to create as much separation as possible between herself and the boy, she remained oblivious to the quiet whispers among the cabin crew, or the way the businessman across the aisle had taken out his phone and was typing a brief message before takeoff. The boy finally turned a page in his book, revealing a chapter about airline ownership and management. For just a moment, the hint of a smile crossed his face before disappearing behind his serious expression as he continued reading, seemingly unaffected by the woman's behavior. The seatbelt sign dinged on as the plane prepared for takeoff. Miss Carter tapped impatiently on her armrest, glancing sideways at the boy beside her every few seconds. She'd finished her champagne too quickly and was already looking around for the flight attendant to ask for another. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now ready for departure. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened," came the captain's voice over the intercom. The boy finally closed his book as the plane began to move, carefully marking his page with a bookmark that looked handmade, colorful construction paper with "Happy Birthday" written in a child's handwriting. He tucked the book into the seat pocket and straightened his seatbelt, following all safety procedures perfectly. Miss Carter cleared her throat loudly. "Excuse me," she called out, raising her hand high even though Rita was helping another passenger just a few feet away. "Excuse me." Rita finished helping an elderly man with his oxygen concentrator before approaching with a patient smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" "I really need to speak with you privately," Ms. Carter said, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that was clearly audible to everyone nearby. She unbuckled her seatbelt and started to stand. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you need to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened during takeoff," Rita said firmly. "Is it an emergency?" "Well, it's about the seating arrangement," Ms. Carter insisted, reluctantly sitting back down. "Surely there must be some other option. Perhaps in the other first-class section. I paid full price for my ticket, and I expected certain standards." The boy's eyes remained fixed on the window, watching the ground crew finish their work, but his shoulders hunched slightly. An older couple across the aisle exchanged knowing glances. "Ma'am," Rita said, her professional tone somehow becoming even more professional, a supple shift that regular travelers recognized as the voice flight attendants used when exercising extreme patience. "As I mentioned earlier, we're completely full today. Every seat in first class is occupied." "But this is ridiculous," Ms. Carter continued, gesturing vaguely toward the boy without actually looking at him. "I have important business materials to review. I can't possibly concentrate in these conditions." The boy pulled a small sketchpad from his backpack and began quietly drawing what appeared to be the airplane they were sitting in, complete with remarkable technical details for someone his age. "What conditions exactly are you referring to?" Rita asked, her smile now firmly fixed in place. Ms. Carter leaned forward and lowered her voice, though not enough. "You know exactly what I mean. I paid for a premium experience." A businessman in a tailored suit sitting across the aisle had been watching the interaction with increasing interest. He caught the boy's eye briefly and gave him a small, reassuring nod. "Ma'am," Rita said, "all of our passengers have paid for their seats, and everyone is entitled to the same respect and service. Now, I need to finish preparing the cabin for takeoff. Can I bring you anything else once we're in the air?" "This is unacceptable," Ms. Carter huffed. "I want to speak with your supervisor. I'm a Platinum member, you know." "I am the lead flight attendant on this flight," Rita replied calmly. "I'd be happy to provide you with information about filing a formal complaint with customer service if you'd like. For now, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened." As Rita walked away, Ms. Carter muttered something under her breath about standards slipping and the airline's declining exclusivity. She pulled out her phone despite the announcements to put all devices in airplane mode and began tapping angrily. The boy continued his detailed drawing, adding small annotations along the wings. His careful focus and the quality of his work drew an appreciative glance from the businessman across the aisle, who seemed to be studying both the boy and Ms. Carter with particular interest. As the plane accelerated down the runway, the boy finally looked up, a flash of pure joy crossing his face as the ground fell away beneath them, the universal excitement of flight momentarily overwhelming the uncomfortable atmosphere his seatmate had created. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Ms. Carter immediately unbuckled and shifted as far away from the boy as her seat would allow. She pulled out her laptop and made a show of working, though she spent more time glancing around the cabin with disapproval than actually typing. The boy remained quietly focused on his drawings, adding impressive details to his airplane sketch. His small fingers worked carefully, and occasionally he would reference something in his aviation book before continuing. "Excuse me," Miss Carter called out again, waving her hand at a passing flight attendant who wasn't Rita. This one was younger, perhaps new to the job. Her name tag read Alicia. "Yes, ma'am? How can I help you?" Alicia asked, her smile bright and eager to please. "I'd like to speak with the captain," Miss Carter said firmly. "The captain?" Alicia's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, but the captain is flying the plane right now. Is there something I can help you with?" "This is a matter that requires the attention of someone in charge," Miss Carter insisted, lowering her voice to a whisper that wasn't really a whisper. "I'm not comfortable with my seating assignment, and that other flight attendant was completely unhelpful." The boy pretended not to hear, though his pencil stopped moving for a moment. Alicia glanced uncertainly between Miss Carter and the boy. "I'll need to check with Rita, our lead flight attendant. She handles all passenger concerns." "No, not her," Miss Carter said quickly. Look, I've been flying first class for 15 years. I know the airline's owner personally. This was a lie, but she said it with such conviction that Alicia hesitated. All I'm asking is to be moved to another seat. Surely there's something available. The businessman across the aisle looked up from his tablet. He wore an expensive watch and had been taking notes about the flight service. Now he seemed particularly interested in Ms. Carter's claims. I can check, ma'am, but I believe we're completely full today, Alicia said politely. It's the holiday weekend, and… Just check, Ms. Carter interrupted, and bring me another glass of champagne while you're at it. As Alicia hurried away, the boy finally looked up from his drawing. For just a moment, his eyes met Ms. Carter's, and there was something in them, not anger or hurt, but a calm assessment that made her unexpectedly uncomfortable. He quickly returned to his sketch. A few minutes later, Rita returned instead of Alicia. Miss Carter, she said, her voice pleasant but firm. Alicia mentioned you wanted to speak with the captain, which isn't possible during flight. Is there something specific I can help you with? Ms. Carter's face flushed. I was simply requesting a seat change. As I've explained twice now, we're fully booked, Rita said. However, if you're truly uncomfortable, we do have one middle seat available in economy that I could offer you. Several nearby passengers looked up with interest. The businessman across the aisle didn't even try to hide his amused smile. Economy? Ms. Carter nearly gasped the word. That's ridiculous. I paid for first class. Then I suggest you enjoy the first class service in your assigned seat, Rita replied evenly. Here's your champagne. Is there anything else you need? Ms. Carter took the champagne without thanks and turned pointedly toward the aisle, away from the boy. This airline used to have standards, she muttered just loud enough to be heard. The boy had completed his drawing. A remarkably detailed sketch of the airplane's interior, including the cockpit controls. He was now adding notes about altitude and air pressure in neat handwriting. The businessman across the aisle leaned slightly forward. That's quite impressive, he said to the boy. Are you interested in aviation? The boy nodded shyly. Yes, sir. I want to be a pilot someday. You certainly know your aircraft, the businessman said with a warm smile. My name's Mr. Wilson, by the way. He held out his hand for the boy to shake. Ms. Carter watched this interaction with narrowed eyes, taking another large sip of her champagne. The businessman's friendly acknowledgement of the child she'd been trying so hard to ignore seemed to irritate her even more. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of what would become a very humbling flight experience. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin settled into a rhythm. Most passengers were either watching movies or napping, but Ms. Carter remained visibly tense. She'd called for flight attendants 3 more times, once to complain about the temperature, once to request a different meal than the options offered, and once to ask for a blanket that she claimed was higher quality than the one provided. Each time, she made a point of speaking loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear her complaints, glancing occasionally at the boy as if his very presence was the source of her dissatisfaction. The boy had finished his detailed airplane drawing and was now reading a book about famous pilots throughout history. He turned each page carefully, completely absorbed in the stories of aviation pioneers. Excuse me, Ms. Carter called out again, raising her hand to flag down Rita, who was helping an elderly passenger across the aisle. Excuse me, I need assistance. Rita finished helping the elderly man before approaching. Yes, Ms. Carter, how can I help you? My entertainment system keeps freezing, Ms. Carter said, pointing at her screen which was clearly working fine. And I'd like another glass of champagne. I'll check your system, Rita said, leaning over to inspect the screen. She pressed a few buttons, and the movie continued playing without issue. It seems to be working correctly now. I'll bring your champagne right away. As Rita walked away, Ms. Carter sighed dramatically. This is why I usually fly Golden Wings Airlines, she said to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Their first class actually feels like first class. This is barely better than economy. The boy glanced up briefly from his book, then returned to reading. His composed demeanor seemed to irritate Miss Carter even more. Mr. Wilson, the businessman across the aisle, had been quietly observing the situation. He caught Rita's eye as she returned with the champagne and gave her a small, reassuring smile. Here's your champagne, Miss Carter, Rita said. The captain has also asked me to inform all passengers that we'll be experiencing some light turbulence shortly. Please keep your seatbelt fastened when seated. Light turbulence? Ms. Carter scoffed. I have a very important meeting tomorrow morning. I can't arrive looking tired because of a rough flight. It's just a standard precaution, ma'am, Rita explained patiently. As predicted, the plane began to experience light bumps. The flight continued with Ms. Carter growing noticeably quieter. She kept glancing at the boy beside her, trying to figure out why the captain had singled him out. The boy remained absorbed in his book, occasionally making notes in a small notebook he'd pulled from his backpack. Rita appeared in the aisle with a tablet in hand. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our meal service shortly. The captain has asked me to provide a special preview of our new first-class menu to a few select passengers today. She stopped at their row and smiled warmly at the boy. Would you like to see the new menu options we're considering for next month? The chef would love your feedback. The boy looked up, surprised but pleased. Yes, please. Thank you. Rita handed him the tablet with a digital menu featuring elaborate dishes and colorful photos. Your father mentioned you especially enjoyed the grilled salmon on your last flight. Ms. Carter's head snapped up at this comment. His father? She asked before she could stop herself. Rita nodded politely but didn't elaborate. Ms. Carter, would you also like to preview our new menu options? Yes, Ms. Carter said, suddenly adopting a much friendlier tone. She leaned slightly toward the boy. So, your dad flies a lot? The boy nodded without looking up from the menu. Yes, ma'am. Must be nice. Ms. Carter continued, her voice now sweet as honey. What does he do? The boy seemed uncomfortable with her sudden interest. He works for the airline, he answered simply before turning back to Rita. The salmon looks good, but maybe with a different sauce. The lemon dill one from last time was better. I'll note that down, Rita said with a smile. Any other suggestions? While the boy offered thoughtful feedback on the menu items, Ms. Carter's mind was racing. A child whose father worked for the airline, getting special treatment from the crew, acknowledged by the captain. She mentally reviewed her earlier behavior and began to look distinctly worried. Across the aisle, Mr. Wilson watched this change with barely concealed amusement. Just then, the co-pilot emerged from the cockpit and walked down the aisle. He stopped when he reached their row. Hey there, buddy, he said to the boy with genuine warmth. Your dad asked me to check how you're doing. Everything good? The boy nodded with a smile. Yes, sir. The flight's been smooth. Great to hear, the co-pilot replied. We should be landing right on schedule. Your dad will meet you at the gate. He turned to Ms. Carter with a polite nod. Ma'am. Then he returned to the cockpit. Ms. Carter now looked genuinely alarmed. She smoothed her hair and straightened her blouse where the champagne had spilled earlier. So, she said to the boy, her voice unnaturally bright, your father works with the pilots. Is he an instructor? The boy shook his head but didn't elaborate, clearly uncomfortable with her sudden interest. Mr. Wilson leaned slightly across the aisle. I believe the young man would prefer to read his book in peace, he said pointedly. Ms. Carter flushed but persisted. I was just making conversation. We got off on the wrong foot earlier. I'm actually very interested in aviation myself, she lied. My company does marketing for several airlines. The boy nodded politely but reopened his book, effectively ending the conversation. Over the intercom, the captain's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a special announcement. Today marks the 5-year anniversary of Atlantic Airways' expansion to international routes. To celebrate, our CEO has arranged for each passenger to receive a voucher for a complimentary first-class upgrade on your next flight. Excited murmurs spread through the cabin. Additionally, the captain continued, our CEO wanted me to personally thank everyone for choosing Atlantic Airways. Dr. Johnson has always believed that providing excellent service to every passenger is our top priority. He's particularly proud of our new first-class cabin design, which his son helped create with his innovative ideas. Ms. Carter's face paled visibly as she slowly turned to look at the boy beside her. Mr. Wilson caught her eye and smiled knowingly. Upgrades are nice, he commented, but I find that treating people with basic respect is always a good policy, regardless of who they might turn out to be. Don't you agree, Ms. Carter? Before she could respond, Rita appeared with the meal carts. "We'll be serving lunch now," she announced. "And I have a special meal for our VIP in 2A, prepared according to your father's instructions." The truth was now unmistakable, and Miss Carter looked as though she might be sick. Miss Carter sat frozen in her seat as the flight attendants served lunch. The boy beside her received a special meal that wasn't on the regular menu, perfectly grilled salmon with roasted vegetables arranged in a way that would impress even high-end restaurants. Meanwhile, the other first-class passengers, including Miss Carter, were given a choice between chicken and pasta. "Is everything to your liking?" Rita asked the boy with a warm smile. "Yes, thank you," he replied politely. "Please tell Chef Mike it's just as good as last time." Miss Carter picked at her pasta without appetite, her mind racing. Every few seconds, she would glance at the boy, then quickly look away when she caught Mr. Wilson watching her from across the aisle. The businessman's knowing smile made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "So," Miss Carter finally said, her voice unnaturally high, "your father is Dr. Johnson, the CEO." The boy nodded simply. "Yes, ma'am." That's wonderful," she said, stumbling over her words. "You must be very proud. I've always admired Atlantic Airways. Best airline in the business, really. I fly it exclusively." This was another lie. She had frequent flyer status on 3 different airlines and often complained about all of them. The boy just nodded again and continued eating his meal, neither accepting nor rejecting her sudden praise. "I'm in marketing myself," Ms. Carter continued desperately. "Perhaps your father and I could talk sometime. I have some excellent ideas for promotional campaigns that could really help Atlantic Airways reach new customers." The boy looked up, studying her face for a moment. There was wisdom beyond his years in his eyes. "My dad says good business starts with respecting everyone, not just the people you think are important." Ms. Carter's smile froze on her face. From the row behind them, an older woman who had been quietly observing the entire situation let out a soft mum-hum of approval at the boy's words. Ms. Carter cleared her throat and tried again. "Of course, absolutely. That's exactly how I run my team too. Respect for everyone, that's my motto." Mr. Wilson chuckled softly but said nothing. Rita returned to collect their trays. "Would either of you care for dessert? We have chocolate cake or fruit tart." "Fruit tart, please," the boy said. "Nothing for me," Miss Carter replied, then quickly changed her mind. "Actually, I'll have what he's having." As if sharing dessert preferences might somehow make up for her earlier behavior. When Rita left, Miss Carter leaned closer to the boy. "Look, about earlier, when we first boarded, I wasn't feeling well. Migraines, you know. They make me a bit short-tempered sometimes. I certainly didn't mean to seem unfriendly." The boy looked at her directly. "It's okay. My dad says we should forgive people when they make mistakes." This simple statement, delivered without accusation but with clear understanding of what had really happened, made Ms. Carter sink back into her seat, thoroughly chastened. Rita returned with their desserts, along with a small envelope that she handed to the boy. "Your father asked me to give you this. It's information about your weekend activities in New York." The boy thanked her and opened the envelope, revealing what looked like tickets to a major aviation exhibition that was happening that weekend. Ms. Carter's eyes widened. "Is that for the International Air Show? Those tickets are impossible to get. My client has been trying for months." "My dad helped organize it," the boy explained simply. "He's giving a talk about the future of commercial aviation." Just then, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into New York. Local time is 3:45 p.m. and we're expecting to arrive at our gate about 15 minutes ahead of schedule. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." As everyone began putting away their items and returning their seats to the upright position, Miss Carter noticed several flight attendants gathering at the front of the cabin, occasionally glancing in their direction and speaking quietly to each other. Mr. Wilson caught her eye. "I should mention," he said casually, "that I'm the Chief Operations Officer for Atlantic Airways. Dr. Johnson and I have worked together for 15 years. He paused meaningfully. "He's very invested in how our passengers experience our airline, especially how they treat his son when they travel alone." Ms. Carter's face drained of all color. "Also," Mr. Wilson added, taking out his phone and checking something, "it seems you're scheduled to present your marketing pitch to our board tomorrow morning." Dr. Johnson will be chairing that meeting. Ms. Carter looked like she might faint. The meeting with Atlantic Airways was her big chance to land the account that could save her job after being passed over for promotion. And now she realized she had spent the entire flight insulting the CEO's son. As the plane began its descent, Ms. Carter stared straight ahead, her career prospects seemingly plummeting as fast as the altitude. The plane touched down smoothly at JFK Airport. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Ms. Carter frantically rehearsed apologies in her head, none of which seemed adequate. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her belongings, accidentally dropping her expensive pen under the seat. "Here," the boy said, bending down to retrieve it for her. "You dropped this." "Thank you," she mumbled, unable to meet his eyes. The simple act of kindness from the child she had treated so poorly only made her feel worse. The captain's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Local time is 4:02 p.m. We've arrived at the gate 15 minutes ahead of schedule. On behalf of Atlantic Airways and our entire crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today. For those connecting to other flights, please check the monitors for the latest information. For our VIP in seat 2A, your father is waiting at the gate." Ms. Carter's stomach nodded. The entire situation felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Just 4 hours ago, she had been confidently boarding the plane, looking forward to landing the biggest client of her career. Now that opportunity seemed to be slipping through her fingers. "Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off," Rita announced as the plane came to a complete stop at the gate. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, most passengers stood and began retrieving their luggage from the overhead bins. Ms. Carter remained frozen in her seat. Mr. Wilson stood and straightened his suit jacket. "It was a pleasure meeting you," he said to the boy, shaking his hand formally. "Your father will be very proud of how you conducted yourself today." "I certainly am." The boy smiled. "Thank you, sir." Mr. Wilson then turned to Ms. Carter with a more measured expression. "Ms. Carter, I imagine we'll see each other tomorrow at the board meeting." His tone gave nothing away about what might happen there. As the cabin emptied, Ms. Carter finally gathered the courage to speak directly to the boy. "I want to apologize for my behavior earlier," she said quietly. "It was inappropriate and unkind." The boy looked at her thoughtfully. "My dad says everyone deserves a second chance if they're really sorry." "I am," she said, and for perhaps the first time since boarding the plane, she was being completely honest. Rita approached their row. "We're ready for you now," she said to the boy. "Your father is waiting." The flight attendant helped the boy gather his books and drawings. Ms. Carter noticed that he carefully tucked away the airplane sketch he had been working on, the one with the remarkably accurate technical details that now made perfect sense given who his father was. Ms. Carter followed them slowly down the aisle, her mind racing with how she might salvage her career. As they stepped into the jet bridge, she caught her first glimpse of the man waiting at the gate, tall, distinguished, in an impeccable suit with the Atlantic Airways executive pin on his lapel. Dr. Johnson's smile widened when he saw his son, but his expression became more measured when he noticed Ms. Carter behind him. The boy ran the last few steps and threw his arms around his father. "Dad, there's my future pilot," Dr. Johnson said warmly, lifting him up despite his being almost too big for such things. "How was your flight?" "Good. I finished my book and made some drawings." Dr. Johnson set his son down and looked over at Ms. Carter, who had stopped several feet away, unsure of what to do. "Ms. Carter, isn't it?" he said, his voice pleasant but with an undercurrent of steel. "I believe we have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning." "Yes, sir," she managed to reply. "I'm looking forward to it." "Actually," Dr. Johnson continued, "I'd like to speak with you for a few minutes now, if you have time. My son can wait with his aunt who's just over there." He pointed to a well-dressed woman waiting nearby. Once the boy was out of earshot, Dr. Johnson turned to Ms. Carter with a serious expression. "Mr. Wilson sent me some concerning messages about the flight today." Ms. Carter swallowed hard. "Dr. Johnson, I want to apologize." He held up a hand to stop her. "Ms. Carter, at Atlantic Airways, we believe in treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their age, appearance, or background. That's not just a company policy, it's a personal value I insist upon." "I understand, sir." I made a terrible mistake today. Dr. Johnson studied her face. Yes, you did. And mistakes have consequences. He paused. Your presentation tomorrow has been cancelled. Ms. Carter felt her heart sink. This account would have saved her job. However, Dr. Johnson continued, I believe in second chances when someone shows genuine remorse. Instead of a marketing presentation, I'd like you to meet with our diversity and inclusion team. They're developing a new training program about respectful service and recognizing unconscious bias. Your experience today, from both sides, might provide valuable insight. Ms. Carter blinked in surprise. You're still considering working with my company? That depends entirely on what happens next, Dr. Johnson said firmly. My son mentioned that you apologized to him before leaving the plane. That's a start. The question is whether you've truly learned something today, or if you're simply sorry you got caught. As Ms. Carter looked past Dr. Johnson to where his son was animatedly showing his aunt his airplane drawings, she felt a genuine wave of shame wash over her. I have learned something, she said quietly, and I'd like the chance to prove it. Dr. Johnson nodded. Good. That meeting is at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Don't be late. He turned to join his son, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Ms. Carter? My son didn't just help design our first-class cabin. He also named our new inclusion initiative. We call it First-Class Respect for Every Passenger. I think it has a nice ring to it, don't you? As she watched Dr. Johnson walk away with his arm around his son's shoulders, Ms. Carter stood alone in the busy terminal, humbled but perhaps, for the first time in a long while, seeing things more clearly than when she had boarded the plane.